So I've taken the baton from Mark. I'll be chairing this second session of the day's event, the showcase. I'm Dr. Graham Beardsmore. I wear various hats. I'm a director of the Australian Geothermal Association, which is really my primary hat here today, but I'm also a director of the International Geothermal Association. Work under the able controlship of Merit. I am a senior fellow at the University of Melbourne as well. But enough about me. There are, I think, 5 speakers in this session. We're going to try to keep them to their 20-minute time slots, but I won't be too surprised given the amount of information that we're trying to impart in a very short time that we may sort of slip a bit, but as chair, I'll try to keep on time. So with that in mind, I will just launch in to introduce Mr. Jackson Grimes, who is the Director of Global Engagement at Project Innerspace. And we don't really have time today to give all the background of these organisations that we've invited to speak, but just suffice to say that when we developed the concept for this global showcase, we really did scan the world to find the absolute best people to speak on the subjects that we've invited them to speak about. So Jackson is the man in the world to speak on this next subject for Project Innerspace. I'm hoping Jackson will give at least 1 or 2 slides background of Project Innerspace itself. It's an absolutely amazing organisation which is driving geothermal adoption in developing economies and expanding its global reach. Jackson has a history from the Iceland School of Energy to the Texas Geothermal Energy Alliance. He has championed geothermal's potential for social impact, workforce growth, and next-generation energy systems. In 2023, he worked with the Texas Geothermal Energy Alliance during a landmark legislative session that positioned Texas as a potential leader in next-generation geothermal systems. Thank you, Jackson. I'll hand the floor to you, and perhaps just say where you were speaking from as well.
Great, thank you, Graham, and good morning, everyone. I'm speaking from Austin, Texas, so I've got my phone light on here so you can see me. It's a little bit dark outside, so first I want to thank the Australian Geothermal Association for inviting Project Innerspace to speak today and to share our latest GeoMap release for Oceania and discuss how geothermal can catalyze Australia's energy transition goals. Additionally, thank you to the Australian Academy of Science and the International Geothermal Association for supporting this event. And of course, I wish I was able to be there today in person, but hopefully we can all meet in the near future and support bringing more geothermal technologies and deployment across Australia. Just one more quick piece of background about myself is my expertise is in policy and social governance associated with geothermal. So while my presentation is going to be focused on our most recent GeoMap module, when it comes time for questions, please remember that I am not a geologist. And if you have a specific query about GeoMap, I will be sharing my email at the end of the presentation, and we can follow up directly with the appropriate Innerspace team members as well. So a quick introduction to Project Innerspace. We're a nonprofit organization singularly focused on driving rapid geothermal scale up to support the global energy transition. What makes us slightly different from other geothermal advocacy groups is that we believe that in order for geothermal to truly become the massive global energy source we know it can be, we will need to leverage oil and gas technologies, workforce, infrastructure, and expertise to achieve massive growth quickly. The Innerspace team is multidisciplinary with experts from across the globe with focuses ranging from geosciences to engineering, policy, finance, and data analytics. So I wanted to show this slide as it highlights the broad spectrum of impact we strive for at Innerspace. Through these initiatives, we're not only informing stakeholders, but also shaping the way geothermal is perceived and prioritized. To truly accelerate geothermal deployment, broad community engagement is required that's meaningful and impactful. And this is essential for making it easier to implement critical policy changes which are often the bottleneck for geothermal development. I'm pleased to be here today to talk about our work and as someone who's come to deeply appreciate the importance of communicating science for real world impact. Over the past 3 years, Innerspace has had the opportunity to engage with a diverse range of stakeholders, hosting technical workshops, meeting with the International Heat Flow Commission, discussing policy options at the White House here in the US, all aimed at shaping future funding and attractive regulatory frameworks for geothermal growth. I'm particularly excited that the Australian Geothermal Association is hosting this showcase today in emerging energy sectors like geothermal, where policy support is essential as are subsidies. It's not enough for us to simply deepen our understanding of the planet with tools like GeoMap, but we have the responsibility to educate, advocate, and inform on those topics. So without further ado, I'm here today to share research that's part of GeoMap. This was an initiative that we launched in 2022. It's the culmination, or it will culminate in 2026 with the release of a global interactive map, which you're going to get to see a little piece of today for Australia. And this is meant to serve as a development guide for ecosystem actors around the world and bringing that surface and subsurface data together to support exploration, planning, and development of geothermal. So, as I said, 3 years ago, Innerspace launched the GeoMap program. It's a research program, and it's focused on understanding the geothermal resources in the subsurface better everywhere in the world. And with a global scope, and we wanted to make sure that the resource is publicly accessible and through a map-based interface. So we partnered with Google Earth Engine on the development of this tool, and thus was born GeoMap. And it has been designed to serve the entire energy ecosystem, from policymakers to developers and to everyday citizens interested in energy. GeoMap represents a globally coordinated multidisciplinary research initiative building foundational geoscience data sets to facilitate advanced geothermal modeling, exploration, and risk assessment. The GeoMap program currently includes 6 funded research projects, all in a global team of about 85 different researchers, all coordinated together to build this strong scientific foundation for further geothermal exploration. All of the data sets that you'll see today have been released as open access resources via GeoMap's online portal, which you can find at projectinnerspace.org. And I encourage you to use the tool to play around with it yourself. There's a lot of cool features that I'm only going to scratch the surface of today. And the goal of publishing this information is to support smarter decisions about where to invest in deeper, more detailed explorations, which is often expensive, time-consuming, and highly data-driven. And so to help with this, GeoMap provides access to 2 key data layers for those investigations. The first of which can be seen here at the bottom of the research, the exploration triangle, excuse me. It's where we targeted the deep subsurface, things that we can't see. So crust, sediments, and the mantle. And these are components that we rely on geophysical modeling and methods to understand them. And then the second layer is more observational and uses surface indicators and shallow subsurface data. By integrating these 2 layers, we can identify areas with favorable geothermal conditions and begin to focus in on where deeper investigation is warranted. GeoMap is not designed to tell you exactly where to drill a geothermal well, but rather to help governments, developers, and communities better understand where resources may exist and where to focus their future investigations. Over the course of this program, many comprehensive and global data sets were compiled and harmonized. These encompass things like the seismic, lithospheric structure, sediment and crustal thickness, tectonic features, surface heat flow measurements, borehole temperature data, among many others. There's close to 400 layers in GeoMap today, and more being added with every module that we release. As mentioned, we partner with about 85 different researchers on this project, so I just want to highlight some of the folks who have worked on this with us. The University of Cambridge worked across tens of thousands of data measurements on the shear wave, crustal, and sediment thickness layers. Tecton Know and Knowing Earth developed the comprehensive tectonic and structural databases. The International Heat Flow Commission, which Graham is also a part of, which was been great to work with them on this work. The International Heat Flow Commission database has about 60 years of data collection, and working with them and funding them to modernize these data sets have increased the depth of these maps. And they've actually been able to revise about 90% of that data in the last 2 years, which is a great achievement. Additionally, the thermal inversion modeling, we partnered with the University of Madrid on this, and it helps us improve the data sets that have already existed and builds the models that you can see in the tool itself. These are some of the analytics that were run. The global heat in place model, our weighted overlay analysis, which uses machine learning to take a lot of these subsurface and surface level layers and build a weighted overlay analysis, which is essentially the favorability of where geothermal can be found, and additionally, screening for super hot rock resources. So a bit about the model that GeoMap was based on. One of the key analysis is the global heat in place model. And the methodology of this is discussed in detail in the recently released International Energy Agency's Future of Geothermal Energy report, which I believe Rebecca spoke on a bit this morning. But just to drive a few of the points home from that report is next generation geothermal has the technical potential to supply 140 times over the current global electricity demand. These geothermal technologies have the potential to meet the not only electricity demand, but heat demand many times over and at affordable cost by 2035 that would make geothermal cheaper than nuclear and competitive with solar, as well as wind paired with battery storage. Next generation geothermal could economically provide heat for about 35% of global industrial demand for heat below 200 Celsius, saving hundreds of millions of tons of carbon emissions every year. And there's more next generation geothermal potential than any other renewable energy technology except for solar. So the Oceania module, which was released just 2 weeks ago, I believe. And when you first look at this map, it may be counterintuitive because we know New Zealand is home to one of the most successful geothermal markets in the world. But this is thanks to New Zealand's conventional hydrothermal systems. GeoMap's analysis, however, includes potential for unconventional geothermal systems, which require next generation technologies to access, such as those deployed by Fervo, Ever, and XGS. The Oceania module itself was possible due to contributions from Geognostic's global sea-based model, as well as data shared by the Australian player to see where the current land titles exist for the geothermal in the country. So it's exciting to see how those resources and availability line up. And the availability of this data allowed us to build the Oceania module. And it would have taken a lot longer if this data was not already compounded and available in this manner. In a lot of ways, Australia's open access model for data is the global standard, and a lot of the work accomplished by the GeoMap team in this module would not have been possible without the public domain releases that are available from the country. So the map itself, just to touch on, shows the cumulative geothermal potential in gigawatts between 0 and 5,000 meters with a temperature cutoff of 250 Celsius. And the total that GeoMap shows for Australia is 1,596 gigawatts of potential, which is nearly 10 times the country's current installed power capacity, meaning clearly that geothermal can meet demand and future demands and really be a cornerstone of the future energy landscape of the country. And despite lacking New Zealand's volcanic resources, GeoMap data shows Australia as just potential in spades. And uniquely, Australia is home to some of the world's largest and hottest sedimentary basins, which hold enormous potential when we talk about next generation geothermal technology. So while the previous slide showed the cumulative geothermal potential, this slide is showing, sorry, something popped up, is showing the subsurface favorability map that I had mentioned, which is the weighted overlay analysis. This technique integrates multiple spatial data layers, like those I mentioned earlier in the presentation, and we apply this to identify and prioritize areas with the highest subsurface potential for geothermal activity. And by incorporating those key geological, geophysical, and geochemical factors This approach enhances the accuracy of resource screening and helps guide further exploration efforts. So on the right-hand side, or on the East Coast, where it is redder, is where the data is showing us there's higher potential for the country. And I would just like to add that even the areas in green are good for direct use applications, where the red is more desirable for electricity production. And so this next image is something that I really enjoy about using the GeoMap tool and being able to share it, is that we not only depict the subsurface data, but also we can go to the surface and look at what kind of infrastructure or regulations might exist at a particular country. And so when we look at these layers here, this particular image is the combination of two layers, which is the major power stations in Australia, ranked by capacity, and then the electrical transmission lines. And so just to jump back to the previous page real quick, just to see how, once again, on the East Coast, where a lot of the subsurface tends to be, when you go to the surface, you can see that this is a lucky combination for the country, as the combination of having that energy infrastructure available where the resource exists indicates that development on the East Coast will have a high impact and quickly. An additional use for the data when we look at the subsurface is to then look at where those energy is being used at the surface. And so this map is the listings of all the industrial heat facilities in the country. And so these include coal plants, things of that nature. This is things like sawmills, paper production, are all included in this list. And so what we have available on the online version is you can begin to rank these based on the subsurface values. So this map here is looking at only the highest level of projects that we would consider low-hanging fruit, in that they surface facilities, heat demand, and location aligned to a subsurface resource. And so I'm going to zoom in a little further into Victoria here and give you an example of what I mean with clicking on one of the industrial facilities. You can see this is a log sawmilling facility. And because of the subsurface resource, it has a favorability score of a 4. And so with this, and knowing that log processing requires less heat than, let's say, steel production, you would be able to develop the resource and the heat needed for that industrial process without having to go as deep as you would in other areas of the country. As I had also mentioned that this includes coal facilities, I would just want to mention that when we talk about coal transitioning to geothermal, which I know Graham has done a lot of research into the past, and that's actually where I first met Graham, giving a presentation at the World Geothermal Congress about the potential for coal conversion in the country. This is reusing existing coal infrastructure, such as the transmission lines, and creating next generation facilities that can tap into the coal infrastructure and cut the cost of developing a large-scale electricity project. Just to go through a few more layers, because I don't want to run too far over my time here. So this map is looking at the granites and the sediment-hosted systems in Australia, and looking at what the opportunities for district cooling are, and especially in the populated regions of New South Wales, Queensland, and Victoria. And this is looking at cooling solutions which require less power than traditional cooling systems, and they're located where they're needed most, in cities and communities. And so this particular layer is showing the potential for using deep aquifers for cooling. And the sedimentary basins that exist in the country are uniquely setted for using these type of systems and helping advance geothermal cooling technologies further. And That is because these aquifers have high porosity and permeability, and that allows them to store and transmit geothermal fluids efficiently. And lastly, data centers are a huge point of conversation these days. We know how much demand there's going to be for not only electricity generation, but water for cooling. And we believe that geothermal should be a part of that conversation because it can not only meet the electricity needs, but the cooling demands as well. And so this map is a combination of the geothermal potential between 0 and 5 kilometers, overlaid with the fiber nodes that are across the country and the broadband mapping, which is the gray lines on this map. The blue circles with the red dots are the fiber nodes. And when you look at this, you can tell that there's a lot of potential, once again, on the East Coast for coupling data centers in these areas and meeting demand using geothermal rather than any other power source. So with that, I know I'm a couple minutes over, but thank you for everyone for your time today. This is my email. If you would like to reach out, we can discuss the details of GeoMap further or anything else that piqued your interest. And thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Jackson. That was great. You made the point that you'll share your slides after. I'll just make the point that the entire day is being recorded and will be made available as a free asset online through the Australian Geothermal Association website and potentially the IGA website as well. We'll allow one question for Jackson. We're a little behind, but I don't want to cut any of our speakers short, so we'll put up with being a little bit behind. Any questions online? Martin? No? Clear? Any in the room? Don't know if you know Jackson, but Phil Henley from Geognostics is in the room, so he would have appreciated your little call out to Oz Seabase there.
Yes, thank you, Phil. Helen says hello, and really it was a pleasure to work with the Geognostics team and using the data that you all have acquired and assembled. You know, it really sped up the process for us to be able to put out the Oceania module, and we look forward to working with you all further as hopefully we are able to do some work in Australia.
And thank you again, Jackson. We'll let you get on with the rest of your Sunday evening over there. We almost lost you a couple of times. Your camera dropped out, but we made it through. Thank you. We'll get you down here in person next time.
Sounds good. Thank you, Graham. Have a good day, everyone.
Okay, we're going to move along, and it is next my extremely great pleasure to welcome Amanda Lonsdale, who is here in person, who's come all the way from Washington, D.C. to be with us today. And as I said in my earlier introduction, Amanda is the person in the world to be talking on this next topic. She's the president of Magnitude Global Finance. She has an MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania in Finance and Entrepreneurship, and an MA from Johns Hopkins University School of International Studies in Southeast Asia Studies. She's advised more than 20 governments on 5 continents on the commercial, regulatory, and policy aspects of geothermal power and direct use development, has led PPA negotiations, drafting and advising on energy policies, and developing commercialization strategies. She served in senior advisory roles to both Power Africa and the UK-funded East Africa Geothermal Energy Facility, looking at innovative financial approaches to develop geothermal power and direct use projects using guarantees and other blended finance mechanisms. In total, she's led or advised on transactions totaling over $2 billion. Amanda.
Thanks. Thanks, Graham. I kind of wish I would have been a little more modest in that bio. That's a lot of pressure, and I'm very jet lagged. But thank you. It's a real honor to be here today in Canberra. I'm really grateful to the Australian Geothermal Association and all the sponsors for the invitation. As Graham said, I'm here to speak to you about approaches to financing geothermal projects with a focus on those incentives and strategies that are most effective in building up an industry. As we heard from Merritt this morning, this initially needs to be led by governments, and that's sort of where I'm starting from today. And in that context, I'll give you examples and perspectives of some of the markets and where I've worked on some of that commercialization strategy. So you just got my bio, so I'm not going to go over it too much, but just sort of a little bit about what qualifies me to speak on this topic. Besides running my own company, I've done a lot of geothermal work over the last 15 years. I went to business school, and when I came out, I wanted to use my degree for good, and so landed on renewable energy and joined a fund that both invested in and developed geothermal power projects. Some of you may know Global Energy. That's where I got my start, and I've been in the industry as a consultant and an advisor ever since. But besides sort of the fancy degrees and all of the brags in that bio, I really think that my biggest skill set is being an interpreter between sort of the geothermal industry, all of the scientists and everyone like trying to figure out what's under the surface or how to build the power plant, and the finance space. I can speak geothermal sufficiently enough to communicate the value proposition to the financiers. I can translate things like IRR, internal rate of return, net present value, waterfalls, et cetera. I can take that and transfer it to my geothermal colleagues. So really kind of acting as this conduit between the two worlds, let's say. And I use this in several contexts we've already mentioned, but mostly working with governments around commercialization strategies, just energy transition, et cetera, trying to help them figure out, what do they have, how do they go about using it, what policies, incentives, et cetera, can they deploy to build up their industry. So at heart, I'd say I'm a tree hugger, but I like to make a business case for hugging trees because ultimately, when a project goes before an investment committee, they don't talk about hugging trees. They talk about profits, returns, and risks, and we need to be able to speak that language. So next, geothermal. I think at least once a month, if not more, I see a headline about geothermal being hot. It's heating up. It's heating up. It's heating up. We see these articles frequently, but really, what is that progress? I think it was last year, one more. The Sierra Club came out with the headline, Has geothermal's moment finally arrived? I think certainly in the US and Europe, we're seeing lots of funding and incentives in support of both power and district heating coming into being. And we do seem to be at a point where we are getting closer to mainstream. We're hearing, as I think our other speakers have really said today, so I don't need to go into detail on that. But I think the description of this summit, when I was looking at it, really kind of lamented Australia's failure to ride this wave in terms of geothermal innovation and development that's occurring globally. We heard a lot this morning about the global trends and resource potential, and had some very good presentations just now about that resource potential in Australia. Later today, we'll hear about some more technologies and projects to help us understand even more about what's possible. But ultimately, one thing that any project or technology has in common is that it has to make economic sense to build and scale. And so I'm here to speak a little bit about what's required in this space and what's been done in some similar markets and where Australian policymakers and other key stakeholders can have the biggest impact on project economics. So, what are the key factors that drive geothermal projects? There's a lot, but I've kind of put it in three buckets. There's the physical characteristics. First and foremost, you have to have a geothermal resource. It needs to be large enough, hot enough, and flow sufficiently for the heat or energy application you're looking to develop. So obviously there's a lot of variability in what is large enough, what is hot enough, but when you're looking at it, you have to have a resource, right? It's also important for these resources to be somewhat close to an interconnection, a heating network, or population or business centers. So you have to check those boxes first, otherwise there's not much of a discussion. But then once you have these resources, you come to the other two, the financial and timing aspects. Projects need to have a power or heat price or some other mechanism that guarantees sufficient revenue over a period of time, which is very key. It has to be over a decent period of time. As we've heard, geothermal is expensive, so you have to have a payback. Geothermal projects like I said, are expensive, so not surprising that project costs are a key driver. So capital costs, or I'll refer it to as CapEx, are very important. And then other aspects are taxes and financing. Financing meaning how much debt, how much equity do you have on a project, how long is that debt for, and what does it cost? The next thing is timing. We've probably heard about the time value of money. It's a very important concept in my world, but essentially the longer you have money in an investment without anything coming back as a return, the lower your return is going. And so long geothermal development cycles hurt geothermal project returns. So this, some of the key drivers of that really are things like permitting, which I think we've started to hear a little bit about today, and in conversations I've had with you folks, I'm hearing how that is a potential issue. And then infrastructure needs, just what is the, are there transmission lines? Is there a heating network? What's the existing infrastructure to make it conducive to developing a project? And then one really important bit is community relations. That's critical to any aspect of a project development, but particularly the timing of a project. That failure to take heed of community relations and really nurture that can really get you in trouble. So we obviously can't control the resource. That's just there. But what we can control are these two on the right, financing and timing. So what can we do with these? So before coming up to the potential solutions, it's important to understand which of these variables impact project profitability the most. The graph on this slide shows some scenario modeling that I did for a project in Croatia, but it's based on a fairly generic power project model, so the results are really applicable across projects and technologies. So what this shows is it shows the impact of a variable on a project return. So I've developed a base case for a project, and then what I've done is done a sensitivity analysis on it. So in this case, we had a project where where drilling was just paid for by the developer, and then I started making changes. So I showed what if 40% of the drilling was paid for by a grant? What about 60? What about 80%? And so this is just showing what those impacts have on project returns. The blue is the NPV, or the net present value of the project, and the green is the IRR, or the internal rate of return, the project return. And so what this shows you is that if you give 80% of, if you cover 80% of drilling costs in grants, your NPV will go up by 120%. Your IRR will go up by about 75%. Just to be clear, that's not a 75% IRR, but it's a 75% increase. If you had a 10% IRR, you'd have a 17.5% IRR. So just to make sure we're reading it there. So what this is showing is that lowering CapEx, or capital costs, has the biggest impact on project returns. This makes sense. Geothermal projects are expensive. It's also the first money that goes out there. You put money in the ground to drill a well early in a project, and if it takes, if you can take that away, that really, or lessen the amount that goes out the door early, you're going to have a much more profitable project. The next is looking at this is a tariff premium increase, so this is what Croatia had. So this is similar, like if you had a feed-in tariff, any sort of top-up or increase to the power price, obviously that's hitting your revenue, and so that's going to give you a very good return. Tax exemption is next. I think I modeled here a 7-year tax holiday in operations. And so that obviously helps the project by getting more cash coming to the project earlier, which helps the return because you're getting more cash to your investors, paying them back for investing in the project. The next piece, there's several of these on here which are not necessarily important to understand every bit of it, but the concept is that these are reducing times to develop. So Croatia has really, really long permitting process. It's actually, most of their permits have to be done consecutively. So when you model out a base case, it can get to 8 or 9 years, which is just not where you want to be in a base case. And so I cut that, I showed what the impact would be of improving it by 24 months or 12 months. And so that's what you see up here in terms of that, the impact on the project. So again, main keys are decrease costs first, increase the top line revenue and guarantee it over a long period of time, do it quickly, and don't take away too much in taxes. So fair enough. So what are some things that governments can do in this? Just at a very high level, they can do things like improve the financial aspects of a project through grants for drilling, other project development costs. We talked a little bit about data today. Anything that can be done to sort of get that resource, what I call de-risked early and paid for. Early money is the best. They can also introduce feed-in tariffs to ensure the sufficient revenue, tax exemptions, tax holidays, et cetera. In terms of timing, really streamline permitting, the reliable infrastructure and community relations. And then finally, just sort of further options for reducing project risk and therefore increasing lender and investor confidence through longer offtakes if the government is the counterparty or other forms of government guarantees. Some of this obviously depends on the structure of the heat or power market that we're operating in, so these are just illustrative, really. But to that end, let's look at what some other countries have been doing to promote geothermal heat and power. It's important to note that many of these policies and approaches are new, so the results that you see in here may not be that impressive on the surface, but it's important to keep in mind that geothermal projects take a while to develop, as we all know, and in most cases, the countries that I've chosen are starting from zero, sort of trying to be similar. I didn't want to show you Kenya and Indonesia, but I wanted to show you some markets that are in similar starting points. All right, so first going to Canada. Canada has taken an approach where they offer tax credits for investment and manufacturing equipment. It's essentially like a 30% rebate on your project costs once your projects are up and running. They've also provided grant support for pilot heat projects for Indigenous communities. And these have overall resulted in a good pipeline of projects in development and significant growth in heat pumps nationwide. But it's important to note that the approach of providing tax credits instead of grants up front can be very effective in terms of building up a pipeline of projects, but it doesn't solve the problem of high upfront costs. And therefore, it doesn't really share that risk with developers. You're not giving them money to develop the project. You're saying, hey, if you manage to get all the way through this, we'll give you some money back. Still great, developers will take it, but the upfront money is usually much better. So it can be a good mechanism for governments that maybe don't have a budget to fund projects up front, but it needs to really be done with clarity and consistency, and it needs to offer, especially for geothermal, a long enough time horizon for projects to come online. So next we'll look at Croatia. I've done quite a bit of work here. I can attest they're very bullish on geothermal and they're proactively pursuing a number of strategies in both commercial heat and power. In terms of what they're doing, they have been using EU funding to drill their own wells for heat and power, and they've been using those preliminary results to develop and promote tender packages. And they've actually been pretty successful in attracting international bidders to this process. One of the other things they offer alongside that is a 12-year feed-in tariff, or it's actually called a tariff premium, so like a top-up to the prevailing market price. It's a good start. It's actually a little bit short for geothermal, but very good kind of model there. As I alluded to earlier, they're really hampered though by their permitting process, which can just cause very, very long project development timelines and therefore sort of really kill the returns. They go below sort of investment grade. This has even led to cases where developers have lost their concessions because they were unable to meet development milestones required in the concessions because the government wasn't responding to their permits. So a little bit of work to do, but they're very keen they're trudging along. So they've one operating plant and another in development, and in terms of heating, it's really still pending with the drilling outcomes, but they're moving us ahead swiftly. I think they just announced some drilling results yesterday, so they're going. Next is France, where I haven't worked but have admired from afar. Geothermal incentives have actually been in place since the 1980s in France. The government has a fund where they share drilling risks with developers and they provide compensation for unsuccessful wells. This started in the 1980s and was recently re-upped with 195 million euro fund, which will provide up to 17 million euros per project, which is pretty significant. So, despite its deeper and lower temperature resources, France has 2,000 thermal megawatts installed, which generates nearly 5 terawatt hours of heat, and they have a target to triple that by 2030. And it's important to note that even though like $17 million seems like a lot of money to offer up to developers from government coffers, but there are estimates that for every euro spent by the government, it has leveraged 33 euros of private investment, so it's really paying for itself. Next, going to Germany, where I worked many years ago. They've had incentives for geothermal in place since about 2010. The main aspects for Germany are 20-year feed-in tariff for both heat and power, and then priority approval for projects as geothermal is considered to have an overriding public interest. So this is a very interesting one and something that, sort of hold that in your head, I think, because it's, we were hearing earlier about how geothermal permitting is considered too hard. Well, what if we flip that script and say it's actually a priority? That's what Germany's done here. Despite that sort of proactive approach, they have seen, it's been fairly modest results. They have about 43 megawatts of power online, but that's in a few plants, and that's up from, I think, 6 before, so, still impressive considering their small and deep resources. They also have 400 megawatts thermal and heat. And so some of the challenges and why some of the more modest progress is really the lower temperature, deep resources. There's also been some investor nervousness, at least when I was getting investment in Germany. They had recently backed off the solar feed-in tariff, and because solar was actually too successful that they had so much solar that they didn't need to incentivize it anymore, which is not really the case in geothermal, but we did talk to a few investors who made it nervous, that made them nervous. So again, importance of consistency and reliability in policies. The other challenge that Germany faces is strong community opposition in some cases. Many of the resources in Germany are really close to population centers. It's the Molasse, as you probably know, is just south of Munich. Lots of people there, and these are the types of resources that require those seismic surveys with the vibroseismic trucks going through town, and can be pretty disruptive. And developers have to spend a lot of time and money raising awareness, holding town meetings, and generally engaging in the community, which can cause delays. Hungary. Turning there, we see a country that's pursuing district heating through a combination of funds from the EU as well as its own budget. It's actually providing between 40 and 80% of drilling costs to companies pursuing heating solutions. One of the most successful examples we have in Hungary is the town called Győr, which is a project developed by Panergy. It supplies heat to the city as well as to the Audi plant in the area. And this is cool because it is a combination of revenue from both the city and that feed-in tariff for district heating, as well as power price or a heat price being paid by Audi. So it makes the project quite profitable. Wouldn't we all love to have an Audi plant right near our heating resource? But they have taken this and expanded it into a city called Miskolc, and there's a similar initiative going on in the town of Szeged right now. But Hungary isn't all perfect. It faces significant challenges in terms of politics and policies. The natural gas industry in the country is very strong, and geothermal is essentially in direct competition in the heating sector. So makes things interesting. It also faces challenges in terms of some conflicting policies. I think we spoke earlier, Rosalind mentioned she would love to do, the repurposing of oil and gas wells. It's, it seems like a no-brainer that you mitigate drilling risk. You've got this fluid coming up and what have you. Hungary has this as well, and they have some companies that are very keen to repurpose some of those oil and gas wells. But at present, the legal framework doesn't allow for that. You can't simply convert an oil and gas concession to a geothermal geothermal concession. You'd have to give up your oil and gas concession, apply for a geothermal concession and get it, which would cost lots of money and lots of time. And so it's really kind of getting in the way of some potentially pretty cool projects, both for heat and power there. And then finally, in Hungary, they have really aging infrastructure in their district heating systems. And so this has actually led citizens to bypass the heating system altogether and install their own boilers, which obviously is, not great from an energy and climate perspective, but also from a customer base for geothermal. Finally, the United Kingdom, we've seen the government providing funding to cities and municipalities to help them convert their heating systems to renewable energy, not just geothermal, but renewable. And the government has also supported a deep drilling demonstration project in Eden at Cornwall to serve as a proof of concept for how to develop their sort of, again, deeper, lower temperature resources. And this has resulted in two major projects in district heating in Langarth and the Gateshead project, which is done through mining water, which is pretty interesting. And then the UK Downs deep geothermal project in Cornwall. All right, so we've seen examples of approaches that work with varying degrees of success. I want to talk quickly about what doesn't work or is less effective. Some of these may be obvious, but I think worth saying. Combining sort of the first three bullets, we can see the importance of policies. Overly restrictive, unreliable, or conflicting policies can really have a chilling effect on investment in geothermal. Developers really need to see a clear path to project development, as well as revenue and other incentives. Lack of clarity increases project risk. Another major factor that hurts geothermal development is failure to engage communities, as I mentioned earlier. Geothermal is more difficult to understand than wind and solar. It involves drilling, which can be scary, and it can also really smell. So these can cause confusion, concern, and what have you in a community. And so really any failure to engage and sort of do at your own peril. So how should governments approach a program to support geothermal? I sort of think of this governments as being, so you can take kind of an active approach or a passive approach, or potentially a combination of both. In terms of an active strategy, this involves direct development of geothermal resources. So carrying out the surveys, drilling, and other studies to actually do that kind of de-risking of the project to prove out that resource or gather more data that can be handed over to developers. It's not on here, but it was mentioned earlier, the sort of like data and resource mapping can also be a very key piece, and being able to share that with private developers is very valuable. Saves money, saves time, helps to de-risk. The other approach, which I'm calling passive, but not in a pejorative way, is to de-risk development through funding and policy improvements rather than a direct role in development. So some of the factors in deciding which to pursue include sort of what's the overall resource potential in the country, what is the national, state, or local ambition vis-a-vis geothermal, and then what is the private sector capacity in your area, either local or international, assuming you can attract international investors. New Zealand has a lot of capacity, et cetera, so it doesn't have to be right in your locality, but what is that private sector capacity to develop? That'll help determine whether you want to take sort of a government-led approach of actually doing the drilling or tendering the drilling yourself, or whether you want to do more passive strategy of, sort of providing the funding and letting the private sector go forward. So other factors to consider, obviously the overall government fiscal capacity, what can they actually do in terms of the budget that they have, the ease of policy change, what that actually looks like and what needs to be done, and then local community relations. So some key questions to ask when you're trying to think of how to approach a geothermal strategy. I think I mentioned it. What is the overall priority for geothermal heat and power in the country or your state or locality, and how does it compare to other sources of energy? Obviously, Australia has a ton of solar. Where does geothermal fit with that in the mix? What is the geothermal potential? Is it more heat, power, direct use, or is it near population centers? What does this actually look like? What could we feasibly be doing? If it's all in the middle of the country, maybe a giant power plant isn't what you're looking for, but maybe data centers. So, really trying to think, taking all those maps that we've been seeing today and understanding what does that actually mean for the types of projects and technologies that we could deploy. How will that impact the cost of development? What are the heat and power prices and other sources of revenue? Are these going to be sufficient for economic viability? What about our permitting timelines? Are they reasonable? Do they inhibit viability? What's the community perception? And then taking all of that, answering those questions and saying, okay, what are the gaps in this from like the perfect project or an investable project and where we are? And then where can the government come in and intervene effectively? So this is a super busy slide, and as Graham noted, it will be provided later, so don't need to write everything down. But these are some funding options, just some illustrative things, kind of summarizing a bit of what we've seen from the other governments. So the first, I think you've gotten the point probably that government grants for drilling can have a really high economic impact. Obviously a con about that is that it requires a direct budget allocation, and drilling can be very expensive. So something that a government needs to consider if they have the fiscal capacity to do. A feed-in tariff, as we saw from the graph, also has a really high economic impact, but it can be the most expensive approach if you get large projects that need significant sort of top up to their tariff over time, because most of these projects are 15, 20, 30 years, so it's something to consider there. Jointly funded or government funded demonstration projects to actually just do a proof of concept. Typically these are smaller scale, so they can be less expensive. They prove viability and create awareness. So it's really actually giving people something to look at. Can be very valuable in terms of helping folks to understand the value proposition. The cons of this, it can be hard to move from pilot to scale. Sometimes you put in all kinds of resources and everything into a pilot and you're not sort of focused on the economic viability. And so sometimes that can get lost in the mix. But it can be a very good option to get things started. Other stuff, vendor and export financing. Australia obviously doesn't get financing from like the World Bank and other places like Kenya does, but there are equipment suppliers like in Japan and other places where the Japanese government, for example, don't have to go to Japan, but they will provide significant export credit financing, and oftentimes they will pass that along to the project developer buying their equipment or what have you. And so it's something to potentially look at, because those can be some of the largest costs for a power plant in particular, but for all projects. Obviously, the downside of that is that you're tied to an equipment supplier if you do that. Drilling or other project insurance to help protect the developer investment through either a full or partial payout in the event of a technical failure, a failed well, a sub-commercial well. Downsides on that, there aren't many private options right now, and part of it, there's also lots of debate every time drilling risk insurance comes up is what is considered a failure versus what is commercial. So there are some issues there too, but it could be a government-led possibility. It's sort of like that, rather than giving money for a grant up front, you could say, we'll repay you if you fail. So it's not necessarily, you're not paying for every well, but you're paying in case of failure. So it'd be more of a contingent liability that you would have there. Investment or tax credits, we talked about that. It comes out of government tax proceeds, so not a budget allocation, so not something that's up front. It's only paid if a successful project comes online. The downside, as we discussed, it doesn't really catalyze development as effectively as upfront grants. And then finally, the active strategy of government-led development. The real upside of this is that it really de-risks projects, and it can mitigate both cost and timing impacts on project returns for developers. But obviously, then the government's sort of in the geothermal business. Either you're building up your own internal capacity or building up that project management expertise to contract out for that. And if you do a bad job of it, you don't drill a great well, you don't collect the data properly, it actually, the private developers won't take it as de-risking, and so it won't catalyze investments. So you have to be real careful how you pursue that. So finally, I'll leave you with some key takeaways. So when determining how to support a geothermal development strategy, cost. The more you can reduce the cost to develop, the better. Lower cost projects have cascading impacts on costs of financing and therefore on power and heat prices. Revenue, ensuring that there is sufficient revenue to help developers cover costs over time and make a profit is crucial. Timing, any way you can streamline development will improve projects dramatically. Demonstration, because geothermal is so nascent in this country, projects that demonstrate its benefit and offer proof of concept will be great momentum builders. And then again, community relations, engage early and often. Make sure that communities are your allies and your partners, or you'll face delays down the line. Overall, keep in mind that the objective is to de-risk projects and encourage development. Whatever combination of approaches you take, clarity, reliability, and consistency are key to promoting developer and investor confidence and ultimately creating a successful geothermal strategy. So with that, I'll thank you for your time. Look forward to taking questions and speaking at the breaks. My contact information is here if you want to follow up separately. Many thanks.
Thank you, Amanda. Did you add in extra slides from the deck you sent through? No? Okay. I must have had an older deck. We're running a bit behind. People in the room can ask Amanda questions at lunch. Are there any online questions, Martin?
Oh, that is, oh, do you need to say it on the microphone? I can just repeat it. They asked, are there any regions or particular types of projects where I see the most viability in Australia today? I am not an Australia expert, so not necessarily, but I do think, I think it was really fascinating to see the data showing like the potential at 3 kilometers, 5 kilometers, 7 kilometers, and that there is a lot. I think when you're at the shallower depths, you're not sort of having that many power projects close to population centers or transmission. So I think it is where it's going to be, probably in the deeper locations, or things where you can be more remote, like data centers or that type of thing. You're probably not going to see a lot of giant utility scale power plants, but more in terms of the heating or that energy for data centers. But I would throw it out more to the experts in Australia to confirm or deny that one.
Okay, thanks,
right.
Amanda.
Yep.
We'll let you go. There's lots of seats up the back if you need to sleep. Right, we're going to move right along. When we sort of resigned ourselves to doing this as a hybrid format, some talks in person, some talks virtual, I was very nervous, but I want to give a huge shout out to Hugh up in the back of the room there, because this is seamless. This is the virtual talks and the in-person talks are seamlessly stitching together. So that's a segue to the next virtual talk, and this one's coming all the way from, I believe, Florida in the US, in the East Coast, from Jay Egg, and the topic's going to sort of lurch a bit. Not sure if it's lurching to the left or lurching to the right. Perhaps Jay will tell us. He's in Florida, so it's probably the right. Jay is president of Egg Geo LLC. Jay's 35 years in the geothermal industry have brought him various labels of visionary and game changer in the adoption and deployment of thermal energy exchange. As a global geothermal expert, Jay focuses on feasibility and design for thermal energy networks and supporting activities involving geothermal exchange implementation, aquifer-related feasibility, and special permitting, such as utility-scale geothermal exchange systems. Jay is a certified geothermal designer, mechanical professional, co-recipient of the 2020 Constellation Prize for Policy Change, and a passionate thermal energy advocate who started his career in nuclear power with the US Navy. Over to you, Jay.
Thank you, Graham. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I really wish I could have been there. I won't go into why I can't, but business is good in the geothermal realm worldwide, but certainly in the United States. We are in a bipartisan geothermal climate here, where whether you're right or left, it seems that geothermal is getting good attention. So we're grateful for that. It is an honor to be with you virtually at the Global Geothermal Showcase. I want to discuss the foundational opportunities for ground source heat pumps in decarbonizing our built environment. And I'm going to draw on some key findings from the U.S. Department of Energy. They have been a great ally and advocate of geothermal technologies. The entirety of my 36-year career in geothermal, starting with the Geothermal Technologies Office. Um, they have been busy doing great studies and reports, and I'm going to cover a couple of them today. In 2023, a landmark report from Oak Ridge National Labs, which was obviously funded by the DOE, established a powerful new framing for geothermal technology. The key takeaway is this: geothermal heat pumps, when coupled with basic weatherization, are primarily a grid reduction, grid cost reduction tool. The fact that they also substantially reduce CO2 emissions is a massive co-benefit. So kind of what we've pioneered at EggGeo, and now and starting with New York State and now into the national realm, is something called thermal energy networks. What this does is bridges the gap between all types of geothermal. Because whether you're doing a geothermal electric plant, an EGS plant, any type of hot technology, data centers, it doesn't matter. It all is interrelated now because we're now moving that thermal energy through the earth, through infrastructure in a way that makes it available night and day to everybody else that you put on this thermal energy network grid. And I want you to think about this as we talk about it, like no different than a natural gas grid in its infrastructure. The difference is that it provides both heating and cooling, and it is non-combustible and renewable. So this was the hardest thing to get through on our efforts there. Now, 15 states now have passage of laws similar to New York's. That's for another presentation, so I'm not going to dwell on that any longer. At a national scale, I cannot possibly give enough attention to the detail in these reports. So I'm going to fly through them at about a minute per slide, but I guarantee you're going to want to take a closer look at this because these numbers are staggering. At a national scale, the impact of mass deployment of GHPs could reduce the need for annual electricity generation in the US by 593 terawatt hours in a grid decarbonization scenario. For some context, that's more than the entire electrical consumption of Australia. This reduction in energy uses a means we need to this reduction in energy use means we need to build less infrastructure. We can actually reduce what the perceived electrical infrastructure is for our new electrified and more decarbonized environment if we do this right. If you ever wonder why geothermal has become so popular at a heating and cooling level, it is not because of its efficiency nearly as much as it is as a tool to reduce peak electrical generation capacity needs. So the same study found that GHP deployment could reduce the need for new power generation and storage capacity by 345 gigawatts. That's hundreds of power plants and batteries that we would not need to build. This directly impacts grid reliability. When compared to electrifying with standard air source heat pumps, GHPs reduce the need for backup capacity by 127 gigawatts in the summer and a critical 185 gigawatts in the winter when grids in cold climates are the most stressed. This one is a little bit hard to get your head around, so I'm going to give you a couple of key points. What you're looking at is a cost in US dollars per ton. Cost in US dollars per ton of cooling or heating. And really, when you think about a ton, it's the movement of energy into or out of a building, 12,000 BTUs into or out of a building. So air conditioning is out of, heating is into. And so when you look at these residential and commercial comparisons, these are the macro level grid benefits. Let's bring this down to a domestic or single building scale. Median national cost estimates for single building geothermal heat pumps in dollars per ton. Values for cost were selected to be illustrative and simplified median estimate aligning broadly with costs of actual projects, as well as data estimates provided by industry. Median values only show the CapEx and tax credit error reflected in is in the total cost bar. These data are medium and meant to show a typical costing scenario. Notes on specific values that you can read in the actual report, which is available online from the DOE, highlight areas where costs can greatly increase or decrease based on specific situations related to a project. But in general, significant differences based on size and age of the building, regional costs of specialized labor, and the relevant geology and local governance of subsurface work will dictate the cost of any project. But it's just interesting to note residential, CapEx, tax credits here, and total cost is here. Commercial is less, and there's a reason for that. It's the economy of volume, and that's part of where thermal energy networks can really help, especially in dense urban areas. So this chart from the new 2025 DOE liftoff report shows the median cost components for residential GHP installation in the US. As you can see, the primary cost driver isn't the heat pump itself, but the loop supplies, the drilling, the installation, and the ground heat exchanger. Those costs vary significantly by region, driven by local geology and labor availability. The total installed cost after incentives can range from around $7,200 per ton in the Northeast to over $11,000 in the West. And there's a lot of reasons for that that have to do with the cost of labor and the cost of contracting in those areas. Now, this one's really interesting. You got to remember for the next slide what I told you about. Okay, it costs 1/3 as much to install air source heat pumps. In a lot of areas, people argue, if you're in San Diego or maybe in Tampa, Florida, an air source heat pump you're hardly able to tell the energy consumption difference. It's always better with a geothermal, but really, where is that break even? So they even did this for us. So take a look at these three maps. So this is an Energy Star map on the left of air source heat pumps. This is a cold climate air source heat pump, and then a geothermal heat pump efficiency chart, basically. It shows the efficiencies of heat pumps in these different areas. Now, over here on the right, you can see the actual COP, which stands for coefficient of performance. The higher, the better. So as you can see, it's actually kind of blacking out much of the upper Midwest and the Northeast here when you get to the Energy Star ratings, and you get into places like well, definitely the upper Midwest and the far Northeast. It's really rough. And you can see these areas like Florida, like I mentioned, and California. They're very mild climates. But overall, that's why geothermal heat pumps are being focused upon. So despite the upfront cost, the performance is unmatched. These maps compare the winter heating COP and the summer heat and the summer cooling COP. The key takeaway is simple. No matter where you are, geothermal heat pumps are the most efficient option, especially in the very cold climates where other heat pumps will need backup heat. So, let's talk about this technology a little bit. If this technology is so beneficial, why isn't it everywhere? Why have I been doing this for 36 years and it isn't already everywhere? And how do we scale it? The DOE's new 2025 liftoff report provides actually a strategic roadmap to do just that. And that's never been done before, not at the federal level. So here's the opportunity versus the reality. In other words, the reality is nobody cares. And I don't mean that to, it sounds very, but I have been a contractor, an engineer, a design build, and now we're fully into the science and data of the technology. I've been involved in all parts of this. And I can tell you, consumers really don't care any more than American consumers would have paid $1,000 per car to put on their own catalytic converters. It just does not happen without a carrot or a stick. And so the reality is what's expected is at the very low end of the scale on both of these maps for residential and commercial. The market could bear easily the next one, but the economic potential is way up here at the darker green lines. So there's a huge gap we need to close, and the only way to close it is with that carrot or stick. So here's the liftoff pathway that the DOE thinks we're going to be able to attain. So pay attention. This is today. This is 2035, and this is 2050. Phase 1 to 2035, we're focusing on scaling new builds to achieve 7 million homes equivalent. By phase 2, and so we're in 2025, so that's 10 years. In another 15 years after that first interval, we expect to expand to scale retrofits to reach 36 million homes equivalent. And there are some great ways that we're going to do that. I wish I had time to cover them all. That's why the report's available. And I know you will enjoy reading it. Here are the key imperatives to achieve this liftoff. The report identifies 5 critical imperatives. The 2 that are most foundational are scaling and training the workforce, particularly drillers and installers. And then 2, developing and standardizing market-ready products and processes to drive down costs and simplify deployment. The 3 others are listed here, but they're all obvious, and we're involved in every one of them here in the United States. So the value proposition is this: peak demand reduction. You can see it here. This is a landmark comparison of 2 commercial buildings built in Oklahoma, identical office buildings. They were twinsies, right in the same office park. One of them had the best air source heat pumps that money could buy, and one of them had the best geothermal heat pumps money could buy. I think they were both a Climate Master brand. This was definitely a Climate Master study. And take a look. This is the middle of the summer, July and August. And then you move into the winter, and this is the winter. And you can see, just like we talked about, how are we ever going to get a grid to achieve this much more peak energy production when we need it the most to heat our homes? And in the one of the things to think about here is that a heat pump, and look at this, I want you to pay attention to something. This is July and August, June. What do you notice? If we take the existing peak for air conditioning, which we kind of already do in most commercial building and all commercial buildings, I would say, and in many, if not most, residential buildings, if you look at the peak, which we're already able to manage for cooling in the summer, what happens? With a geothermal heat pump, it's actually reduced while the air source solution is what blows up the grid. So is it starting to make sense? This is the value proposition. It's clear at the building level, geothermal provides remarkable peak demand reduction. This case study shows a 33% average reduction compared to a standard system, which eases strain on the grid compared to a standard system and lowers costs for everyone. So this isn't just about efficiency or decarbonization. It's about resilience. When you put in air source equipment at a commercial level or a residential level, you normally have to have an outside condenser, an outside cooling tower on the roof or beside the building or the office park, outside condensers by the dozens or at least one large one per building. And with a geothermal solution, whether it's a deep urban solution with an energy network or individual one-off systems, you have all underground infrastructure. Now that does a couple of things. One, it really increases the life of your equipment by a factor of about 3. And two, it eliminates weather-related failures that can happen intermittently or because of a heat pump being covered up by snow or being struck by lightning or run over by a lawnmower and cut. We just had I just bought a new home in Florida that has an air source heat pump, and they already cut one of my control lines to my air conditioner outside. I will be putting a geothermal heat pump in here as soon as I can. It's hard to get those drillers out though now, which is one of the problems we're facing with this uptick. So as part of the real, and this is a nice image of a 911 center. This is what we call in Florida, the last man standing. This building has to operate when 200-mile-per-hour winds are bombarding our shore. They chose geothermal, not because of its energy efficiency, but because it couldn't get blown away. The cooling towers outside are sails. They're going to get blown away. They're going to get destroyed by trees and debris. Everything's indoor with these systems. The only thing that's outside is these little valves with parking barriers that, and they're redundant. There are several different pathways for them in this case, or they can be put underground, but they just connect to the wells underground that go into these exchangers and cool this entire campus. So uh, as we close, and I wanted to make sure and keep Graham on track, I think I ran him over the other day. I was just at a conference, an oil and gas conference in Texas last week or the week before in Dallas, where I had the privilege of doing one of the keynotes. And General Paul Nakasone said the conversation about energy is no longer just about sustainability. It's about security. It's about resilience. It's about our infrastructure, which is facing new and evolving threats. The energy sector, which this is, heating and cooling is part of the energy sector, is the most important sector to our nation and actually to the world. So thank you for your time. My name is Jay Egg. You can scan that QR code and go to our website, or you can contact me at any of these data points below that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. That was great.
You're welcome.
Any questions in the room for Jay or any online, Martin? Question?
So the question is from Ben Adams, and his question is very interesting comparison to air source heat pumps. Do you know what depths the DOE use for their ground source heat pump comparisons? And could you see any major gains to be found from going deeper?
Oh, very good. You know, that's an interesting question that has multiple facets. The average depth of geothermal heat pumps that are installed with vertical exchangers in the US is about 500 feet. And from 500 feet, you can get about 2 refrigeration tons of heat rejection. So, what is happening now, and they're exploring it, some of the most innovative companies in the world, which are actually owned by some of them by oil and gas equipment companies such as Schlumberger, they are going much deeper so that a drill rig can stay on the same spot and do one borehole for one structure or one house. Another one, a Google X spin out called Dandelion Energy, kind of pioneered that. They said, forget the 500, we're going as deep as we need so we don't have to move. When you have to move from hole to hole for different connections for a geothermal array, well then you've got extra headering on the top. There's more valves, more labor. They want to do one and done. And so, yeah, they're going much deeper. There are those that are saying that they regularly go 2,000, 2,500 feet for a low temperature exchanger. And that does save money if the drill rig equipment can, and the skill is there for that. And it's quickly coming into play as part of the reduction strategies. Great question.
Thank you, Jay. I think I have to call it quits there. We're already talking a bit behind. So we'll let you carry on with your evening over there, Jay. I do wish you were here to carry on the conversation over lunch, but next time.
Next time for sure, Graham. I promise you. I didn't get a chance to tell everybody, but I have a deadline on 2 textbooks which are critical to our economy and our infrastructure here. And if you don't do it right the first time, when are you going to ever have time to do it?
Send me 2 signed
again?
copies then. See you.
Yes, sir.
See you, Jay.
Bye.
All right, moving along. And it's now my pleasure to invite somebody who is in the room. Hugh? I just can't remember if it's Jeremy or... It is Hans. Okay. I will grab this piece of paper then and introduce Hans Dick, who is the Business Development Manager for Renewables and Energy Efficiency Asia at SLB New Energy. Hans's unique perspective, shaped by both technical expertise and strategic leadership, makes him one of the world's leading voices on how geothermal connects with and complements other energy and commodity systems. Thank you, Hans, and welcome to Australia for the first time.
Thank you, Graham. This works just here for the slides?
I believe so.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you for that intro. I don't know who put those words, but I appreciate the invite. Mark, Graham, for having me here in the Australian Geothermal Association, and it's an honor for me to be here. And I also want to acknowledge Anne Robertson-Tate, who couldn't make it, but she also was very active and part of the presentation that I'm going to give to you today. So, no further ado, I'll try to be quick. I'm cognizant that probably you guys are getting hungry, so let's go with it. So, I think my presentation is on synergies, and I think we've seen several presentations already touching on that. So clearly, geothermal portfolio is expanding through these complementary synergies that we have with other energies. And I think I put out here a list that obviously not exhaustive. I tried to cover as much as I can during this 20-minute presentation. So I'll cover oil and gas. We already had a few examples. In Australia, it seems to be very relevant. Solar, wind, critical minerals, energy storage, green hydrogen, CCS, and data centers. So let's move forward. So starting with oil and gas, by the way, my background is oil and gas. I guess I'm an example of somebody transitioning from oil and gas into geothermal. It's for good or bad, let's see. But obviously it's been very exciting to me to move forward. But here I'm showing an example from oil and gas. This is Texas. It's obviously showing a map with the geothermal gradient. And if we see, I mean, most of the highest potential is obviously that southeast coast. This is primarily sedimentary, and we've seen a lot of companies starting to look at this, existing oil and gas operators that have assets. Obviously, they're now trying to assess, hey, could I develop geothermal power or heating? Most of the cases, as was mentioned in previous talks, is co-produced water. So what used to be not good news for oil and gas, we encounter water or the water cut was too high. Now it's potential for, obviously, for geothermal. And in some cases, they're also looking at basement rock. The geology in this part of Texas is actually very interesting because actually towards the southeast, it's where it starts getting quite deep. That basement rock starts dropping very fast. And as was mentioned, leveraging existing data, existing infrastructure. But here's where it's key, no? One thing is obviously we have already, in a lot of cases, the characterization in place. So let's obviously take advantage of that. Infrastructure, let's remember, typical oil and gas wells, especially in land, tend not to be the size of geothermal. In geothermal, at least if you're planning to generate megawatt, you need big well. You need wells in the order of 50, 100, 150,000 barrels per day. So a well that is not big enough, it's not going to be feasible for geothermal. That's one thing. Some of the other challenges that we've seen being involved in this process is how to, if there is any kind of, if we're not producing, especially at the beginning, we tend to see sometimes co-production of potentially hydrocarbons, gas, and how to handle that, where to do the separation, where is more efficient from a thermal efficiency point of view, okay? I think what we have seen quite a bit in any case, definitely smaller scale kilowatt applications. And actually one of the examples that I know is from my home country, from Colombia. There was one oil and gas operator who did this for, in Colombia, a lot of the fields start producing water, and obviously as the asset develops, the water cut starts getting higher and higher, and then there's one operator in particular that deployed a small modular ORC and is helping to offset the power consumption in their own asset. Next one, with going for solar. So starting on the left on the bullets, so obviously the main one of the typical applications is parasitic load of the power plant. So this is using solar to feed into geothermal. If we start, I have there complementary generation. So if we see the left graph, this is on a daily generation, especially for air cooling technology. You have geothermal is base load, but actually there is a variance during the day. So as subject to primarily to the ambient temperature. So especially in locations where you have a bigger drop from day to night, and just because of air cooling is more sensitive to this, you might see a difference of 20 plus minus % in the power output from geothermal, especially with ORC, which is becoming more and more, and I guess air cooling, because it doesn't consume water, is becoming, I guess, if we would look at the trends, it's becoming more and more prevalent in the industry. But if we look also at annual profile, there is actually also a very good match with solar. If you see, I guess, in locations when you go from winter or surface the same summer, you see the same, right? Where when the temperature is going, let's say a higher surface temperature because it's the day, obviously we're generating power. That's a point where the delta T in geothermal is not as high, and obviously the output decreases. So there is a good match or complement between the two. I think also, of course, that means collocation it's very relevant. I'm going to give a couple of examples. Another application sometimes is using that solar to boost the inlet temperature at the heat exchanger, and then getting a better efficiency in the surface cycle. Talking to some of the people having implemented this, one of the comments was leveraging the efficiency, or meaning if you could plan this from the beginning, you could have some synergies in terms of, for example, planning for a single central control room that manages both, and not sort of developing the solar after you have already geothermal in place. So that's one of the efficiencies to take advantage. And I guess the question which I leave on the room is there a way where then the geothermal developer as well could have an incentive to apply the PPA when selling power to the grid, solar power to the grid. And of course, this has to maybe have some constraints or limitations, but this would greatly aid in thinking about co-development of solar with geothermal. So this is just a slide showing the air cooling binary technology. This is from a particular plant. Here we have 3 examples, 3 different power plants that have then built PV solar farms next to their geothermal power plant. And one of them includes also the thermal boost at the inlet temperature of the heat exchanger. And I think this is, a good slide to show, if we start on the right, a good way to visualize the difference in surface footprint between geothermal, as has already been mentioned, and solar. So we clearly see it's 1 to 10 more or less. These are not equally big. One is 33 megawatt geothermal and the solar is 25, but we get the picture when we say much more efficient surface footprint for geothermal. But then on the left graph, we see in this case, the blue one is the geothermal output, which is baseload, but we see that decrease during the day, and how, in this case, they went for obviously, not only offset, but they actually generate more. And again, this is where if they could access the PPA that geothermal has, could potentially make this a much more interesting economic endeavor. Going next now is geothermal plus wind. So the natural fit would be, one, again, parasitic load. I think what we see here is that match, that complement between the two is not the same as with solar. There's the intermittency of wind is much more, let's say, unpredictable, and might change during a day much more than what you see with solar, and then any mismatch is not as easily addressed with by short duration storage like batteries. This is again showing a map of Texas and I guess south of US, and I guess trying to match basin with wind farms that are already in place. So of course that's obviously the low-hanging fruit of going into where can I try to develop. I have geothermal potential and I have wind potential. So here I'm showing again the red one is the power output from the geothermal and how it looks with wind, and again that there is not an obvious complement between the two. So just to give you that example. Next one is geothermal plus critical minerals. As we know, this is typically in hydrothermal settings. We have an opportunity to, typically that geothermal brine has quite a few minerals, and obviously this is another co-production that can be leveraged within geothermal. We know we can find lithium, manganese, zinc, cesium, and we are seeing some deployments already taking place. Some of the hot areas are Salton Sea, and there is obviously in Europe brine graben, just as two examples locations, basins where you have certain content of critical minerals that then they're going for pilots or actual commercial production. And you still have your geothermal power plant. You take obviously you're producing power, and then after that initial heat exchange, you take that brine, extract minerals, and then send it back for reinjection. Now going into geothermal plus energy storage. And obviously here the aim is to store geothermal energy, for example, during periods where you have excessive power supply. You would typically think about battery or thermal energy storage as a way of storing that energy. And in some cases, there is a commercial incentive, because then you can, when there is excess of power, you can store that energy and then go and sell it at periods where you have peak demand. The graph shows the famous duck curve from California. And basically, it's the net demand of power after removing wind and solar. And clearly shows primarily the effect of solar during the day and how over time, this is actually, couldn't find the latest from after 2023. But it shows how that hole during the day, as more and more power solar power has been installed in California, became a much bigger and bigger hole, to the point that, I guess in 2023, you had periods where during the day, pricing could go negative. And then dealing with the huge demand, or being able to supply demand at a peak time towards the evening hours, 6, 7, 8 o'clock. So I think this is another area where geothermal could, if able to combine with energy storage, could become a very interesting solution for this type of challenge that we have. And here, I'm gonna talk a little bit about EGS. This is modeling that has been done by Wilson Riggs and the Princeton research team that have been modeling energy systems, the mix of energies in a decarbonized scenario. So what you see on the left is inflexible EGS, which means you're not able to, basically EGS is supplying power as base load constantly. And then on the right, you have flexible, where you might store that energy during periods of excess supply during the day. In this case, the yellow is solar, and then provide that supply during peak times. If you see in the bottom part of both graphs, the brown and the blue, those are kind of the base load. You see EGS there, you see hydro, and clearly the difference from the left to the right is you're using EGS. If you're able to use EGS as this flexible system where during the day you store that energy and then you supply that during the evening times. First, obviously, accessing much more attractive commercial rates, and then solving part of the challenge of how do I provide energy at those times. It's a very interesting subject. Obviously, we don't have the time, but part of what the overall analysis of this type of projection showed is that geothermal, being this base load, is a key ingredient to lower the need for how much installed capacity you need in your system, versus not having geothermal and then having to rely on other options, renewables, plus batteries or other type of energy storage systems. So it's also the economic impact of how much do I need as an entire system to be able to cope with the demand. Another one, well, I forgot, I think I should mention on this one, there was one of the examples of this flexible EGS was one test that Fervo did, and at least they disclosed some information in 2023 when they did their first pilot in Nevada. And part of that well test they did to demonstrate flow rates and how much power they could generate out of an initial pilot. included doing some trials where they close the well, the producer, and start storing and letting the injector store that energy subsurface, and then opening it up. So it clearly showed, obviously, you have a greater supply once you open that well after a close period, and that, I mean, this is obviously we need more data points, but there is that's where this concept of inflexible versus flexible EGS is coming from as well. Next one is geothermal plus hydrogen. So I think the need for hydrogen production, this would be in terms of the profile that it requires of base load power and ideally clean, then geothermal is obviously a good fit. What I know, at least in the region, there's been one announcement in Indonesia between Pertamina and Chevron, but beyond that, I don't think in Australia this has been announced, but this is probably the one project in the region that I'm aware of where you would co-locate geothermal to feed hydrogen production. Next one is geothermal plus CO2. So I think there's quite a few names. I've seen CPG, which is CO2 plume geothermal, I think. I've heard also CO2 dissolved in Europe, in France. NGP was next generation geothermal power. So the concept is looking at CO2 as a working fluid, and it might have some benefits in terms of having a different density, viscosity versus water, and then being the fluid also that you are basically circulating across injector production and surface, right? There is technology for CO2 turbine and generating power. So that's one potential application. There is also the fact that you have in some of the hydrothermal fields, you have CO2 production as part of the NCG, non-condensable gases. So this is something that is already being deployed, pilots in New Zealand, and I think other countries with large installed capacity for geothermal are trying to look at. Can I capture the CO2 on surface after the heat exchange and then actually re-inject it back to the subsurface? Challenging in hydrothermal is obviously, when I start looking at that from a CCS perspective, CO2 permanent storage, is how, if I'm able to demonstrate how that CO2 is going to behave, can I ensure that it's going to stay enclosed over time? So in a system that is highly fractured with likely faults nearby, this is extremely challenging, but that's, I guess, something that probably will become more relevant. But at least the NCG, or how, if I can capture that CO2 that in some cases geothermal brine has, is one of the angles that existing geothermal operators are looking at in the region. And then we saw quite a bit with geothermal and data center. Again, data center, typically in terms of the requirement of power, base load, and clean, is clearly a very good fit for geothermal. So obviously, one ideal is the co-location, where I'm able to develop a geothermal resource next to a data center. In that case, I might not depend on the grid, or it would be basically the co-location would diminish this challenge. There is one PPA that has been announced in Asia, in Taiwan. It's fairly small, but I think it's important in terms of starting to give visibility to this type of application. It was only 10 megawatts with one of the hyperscalers and a geothermal developer. So definitely, I think the expectation is that this PPA could be more attractive versus any feed-in tariff or whatever the market pricing that exists in that particular control location. If we look at the projection of data center demand by region, Asia is clearly, with United States or with North America, is one where you have the biggest demand coming up. And I don't have this exact split in terms of Asia Pacific, but obviously Australia is one of the key players in that. So clearly, I think that's one of the very good potential opportunities to do geothermal with data centers. And I think there are other applications, could or not could be applied for Australia. Greenhouse farming, there's this, in Europe, for example, there are several examples of this. You mentioned, I think it was mentioned Molasse earlier, there's a fairly recent project that was a public-private partnership, and the private developer funding the project was actually, they're in this business of greenhouse farming. You have biofuels. I think there's examples, for example, in El Salvador, where you would generate aviation fuel in a process that is supported by geothermal. I think the topic around frequency control and ancillary services is quite interesting, because this geothermal could be a solution of the challenges maintaining the frequency of the grid. And then actually direct air capture is another one. That actually, most of the energy requirements are more heat than power. It's 80% heating. So if you're able to collocate geothermal, the temperature requirements are actually lower, being most of it heat and not power. That's a very good fit potentially if that becomes commercially viable in long term. So just to summarize, I hope you're convinced that there is a lot of opportunities of geothermal being a complement to a lot of these other type of applications or energy systems. I think definitely for Australia, I don't know how much if there has been some type of deep dive, but that's probably one of the opportunities looking forward. I think if you can involve some commercial incentives, as I mentioned, for example, solar with geothermal, that would clearly be a boost for this type of systems. And I guess you saw pretty much in every example I was giving, I was talking about co-location. And I think leveraging the potential synergies that might not be as obvious, like when I mentioned having a single command center, etc. So with that, I finish my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, the speaker has left the floor, so no questions. Thank you, Hans. Thank you, Hans. We are into lunchtime, but we're going to forge on, and Jeremy is going to keep us all entertained and not thinking about how hungry we are. Jeremy O'Brien is Segment Director for Energy at Seequent, and I'll just plug Seequent. They're a strategic partner of the International Geothermal Association, helping us do our great work around the world. With a background spanning geology, geochemistry, resource evaluation, and strategic leadership, Jeremy has worked with Mercury in New Zealand, Halliburton in Europe, and now Seequent, helping the global teams ensure the longevity and economic viability of geothermal resources. I'll just handball straight to you, Jeremy.
Thank you. Where's the, is that the control there?
Yeah, one of them. That one, I guess.
Okay. No, that works. Perfect. Firstly, kia ora, and I'm standing between you and lunch, so I promise to try and be as fast as possible. I think I'm 1.5 behind, so we'll see how quickly we can use the Kiwi accent to get there. It's my absolute pleasure to be here in Canberra today. It's my first time here in the Capital Territory, so I'm actually really excited to be here on a personal note. A couple of New Zealand facts that I can use to fill in Hans's presentation. We do have green hydrogen production from geothermal in New Zealand right now at Mokai, so that is happening. And we have hectares and hectares of tomatoes and capsicums grown in the middle of winter from geothermal in New Zealand as well. So it is actually one of the government's biggest pushes right now is for low enthalpy, low temperature geothermal for agricultural and horticultural production. So it's a big area for us. But I thought I'd start by talking about how things change with time. If you wind back to 2019 in maybe October, timeframe August, October, there was this little company a couple of ex-oil and gas people who were saying, we're going to drill horizontal wells and we're going to start to stimulate them and create reservoirs of geothermal. Now, A number of our friends in this audience had been down that road before in the middle of Australia. There was scepticism, of course, because people were like, well, you know, this is technology, how long is it going to take? So for one reason or another, fast forward to 2022, you can imagine why maybe that was, and I arrived back on the shores of the United States of America. Things have changed. We've got a few horizontal wells being drilled and some tests, which Hans just mentioned there. Fast forward only 1 year later. So remember I started in 2019. Now I'm only talking about a period between 2019 and 2023. All of a sudden, we have a situation where we've got multiple horizontal wells of hydraulic fracturing, and we've got a successful pilot with flow rates which had exceeded any other EGS pairing that we'd had anywhere. Fast forward 1 more year, 2024, we have a commercial, almost commercial scale pilot running with multiple horizontal wells. And this is where technology has become such a groundbreaker. The collaboration between government and industry in that period of time in the United States of America led from, no, we could just drill one horizontal well, to drilling a series of horizontal wells, pairing them up and matching them on one pad, and starting to drive down the economic cost, the CapEx cost, which Amanda talked about so importantly, to make these projects more successful. All of a sudden now we've got temperature, we've got permeability, so we've got flow through the rocks, and now we've got the scaling up, and we've got some of the biggest companies in the world putting their financial capital behind it. So I just want to, in the Australian context, you were pioneers in this area not that long ago. Just remember that. It's big from a Kiwi saying that too, right? You know, you're good at something. So everything has changed so quickly. And Jay's presentation is also like a secret that's hidden in the world, which people haven't been talking about. The world's moved, and that's why I think Australia is so interesting. I won't dwell on this, but I'm going to give you some global perspectives of what's been going on. I also shouldn't need to tell anybody in this room that absolutely everything that we do, regardless of whether we're talking about geothermal, everything we do, everything we use, no matter what it is, everything we eat, relates to what's under our feet. It's a pretty sensible thing. It was really interesting, Rachel talking about this morning about the identification of geoscience has been really important. So I think what's incredibly exciting about this is as society starts to understand the reliance we have on the things beneath our feet, just as much as the air we breathe, the underground and things which we do to support our society can become more and more front of mind. Just a very quick overview of who we are. So we're Seequent. We're over 800 people globally. We're headquartered in Christchurch, New Zealand, although we're part of the wider Bentley Systems group of about 6,000 people. And we are across multiple industries. And I guess another shout out to Australia is I wouldn't be standing here today if it wasn't for the collaboration between our predecessor company and the Australian mining industry to boom our business into where it is today. In energy, we support all the main markets. Geothermal we'll talk about in a second, but we support the oil and gas industry, so there'll be a lot of this crossover technology play between oil and gas and geothermal, carbon capture and storage and offshore wind, a number of things which Hans mentioned in the previous presentation. But we are a truly global company with people all around the world. So if we think about geothermal, we understand the domain because we are everywhere. We've been in Australia for a number of years, funnily enough, with the things that have happened here. But our presence gives us insights into the world which are pretty unique. And this is because we invested in geothermal early before the slide said geothermal was hot. And so it gives us a really unique perspective. And what I want to try and do today is give a couple of analogues to the Australian context and see if we then can't relate that back to what's happening in Australia now and hopefully food for thought over, excuse the pun, over lunch. So there's three things happening at the moment which I think are key. I've touched on horizontal drilling and stimulation. I think we can park that to one side and talk about that. Coupled simulation is another one. Geothermal has been primarily a very academically driven industry because of the nature of its growth to date. As we've seen this change happen, now we're starting to treat it a lot more like we would treat normal oil and gas workflows. And so we're just seeing the beginnings of the benefits of actually connecting the subsurface with the facilities at the top. And this is crucial when you think about emerging markets like Australia, where depending on no matter whether it's heating and cooling or power generation, you actually want to take in the full context of what the operating asset looks like, because without that, you end up having discrepancies between what you actually build and what the reservoir can provide you with. And the third thing which is happening because of this is we're starting to see streamlining of exploration. We're starting to see more and more robust workflows start to appear that have been not only built up from the ground up in the geothermal industry, but things starting to come from the outsides, from the likes of the mining industry and the oil and gas industry. So these three themes are really important. And as I talk through these examples, I think it's important we keep these as context. So there's two global analogues. I've touched on Fervo, but I will go back there. And then I'm going to take us to Europe, and I'm going to take us to Putty, which might get us excited for lunch. So I come back to Cape Station, the development and Fervo's development, and thank you very much to the Fervo team for that really great video to start with the introduction. We've seen a dramatic change in the landscape around CapEx, and that's crucial because drilling in geothermal has often been this side of the room issue which everyone brings up every presentation. We've got to get drilling CapEx down. Amanda showed how insurance schemes or upfront financing can help with that, but the more industry can do to innovate to get rid of that perception, the better it is for the industry. What we haven't talked about in a lot of the cases with this, and people might not be aware of, is how closely aligned the Forge, the Department of Energy funded research program, the Forge program, and the Fervo's success have been. I think it can't be understated that even though they were working in parallel, private and public, I think that program is a massive win in terms of seeing science-backed innovation lead into commercial fruition. And so I think if you think about the way things could look moving forward, I think if we can get this directed federal or government-based funding to come in early enough to be alongside the private, so we're learning in parallel rather than one being way ahead of the other, I think that would be really helpful in some cases. And the big change with this reduction in the drilling days curve that Fervo's done is the investment profile, right? I don't think, for those of us who have been around, you know, I worked inadvertently, Amanda and I found this out this morning, around drilling wells in the Chilean Andes back in the 2010s. Raising capital for that had always been, you know, difficult, and there'd be different, very specific types of investors. If you look at the plethora of investors that are now looking at geothermal because of the successes of some of these things in North America and Europe, we're just seeing such a diverse range of funding coming from not only institutional investors, big tech, but, you know, people who would normally be associated with wanting very short-term returns are arriving into the scene. So that, and the fact they've raised $1 billion in particular in the last few years is just it's a scale of something we haven't really seen in industry in recent times. But the integration work here of landing these wells and making sure they are in the right zone for stimulation and making sure the product to match these wells up was absolutely critical, and that was something that we worked alongside the technical group there at Fervo, and they've done an amazing job there getting to where they have so far, which is really cool. I would put on a French accent, but that wouldn't be probably that great. But so this is one of these geothermal hidden secrets. And I think the one thing as an industry we could get better at is getting those hidden secrets available in the public in ways which people can feel and touch it practically. You know, I would have never imagined you'd be able to explain that the Paris Basin had been producing, you know, heat for now 250,000 homes since the 1970s. And this is a great analogue for Australia, right? We've got these big hot sedimentary aquifers, particularly if some of them are co-located with, we saw the geomap with some of them co-located on the east coast. The temperatures in these reservoirs are only around 75, 80 degrees Celsius. They're in carbonates. Again, another secret. This was oil and gas exploration way back that ended up being a geothermal play, right? The same basin that was explored for oil and gas. So this oil and gas technology crossover piece isn't new either. We just have to keep moving forward with it. But the key point that's been made a number of times today is this concept of offsetting the need for energy. And what this does is it offsets the need for other fuels or other sources to heat and cool homes. And this is just such a great example of a large sector of a major world city being heated by a geothermal. And so we cannot underestimate getting that message around heating right and getting that piece sorted. And I think the IEA report just started to scratch at the surface of starting to unpick that, which is really exciting. But again, here's an example where integrated science together with technology has been able to really push forward the understanding of this. Of course, people are going to want more of this now, but it's just as important that this resource is sustained and can continue to provide what it does today. So those are two examples where I think we can see, relative analogues to what we are maybe talking about here in an emerging market in Australia. So what about Australia? As you guys don't know what A or U is. I couldn't come here without a dig. I was going to title this slide, "What about the West Island?" For our international viewers, that's the other island of New Zealand, the North Island, the South Island, and the West Island. But what I hope to articulate with the slide, and I haven't given credit perhaps as much as due to a couple of those previous slides, there's a lot of people in this room already who are doing a lot of hard work to keep things moving and get stuff happening. So if we perhaps go from west to east, so there's a number of activities in Western Australia where there is hot sedimentary aquifers, which are hot in the terms. These are 150 to 200 Celsius opportunities, which are actually co-located with CCS and gas permitting environments, where there is opportunity to, one, work with those assets in their actual, we talked about co-location, work practically with those assets in those locations, and start to get those moving. But again, it's getting from that tan colour to the green colour, and I think that's a big thing that in this room maybe we would look to challenge ourselves towards is how can we help the regulatory environment here get those projects moving forward faster. So those are exciting things to think about. So there's some examples from the Canning Basin and the Perth Basin there, and Martin, who's here today, can talk to you in a lot more, and others, Mark and others, can talk to you a lot more about those. But there are significant opportunities there with industry. There's multiple industries. The mining industry isn't very far away from these places either. So there's multiple opportunities here for baseload power and heat use. Highlighting the Cooper Basin, so that was work that was done a while ago that's been highlighted this morning. I don't want to dwell on that, but I think as we saw Rosalind's commentary this morning about co-produced fluids from oil and gas and the volumes there is, but also looking back to, again, talking about co-location of activities. We've got the Moomba CCS project here in Central Australia and things at the moment. So there is this opportunity perhaps for geothermal to have the renaissance in that Central Australian area. And then I think, there's lower temperature, but equally as exciting opportunities in places like Gippsland, where there is work going on at the moment to look at how the industry can move forward there. And I think the Paris Basin example I just showed with the temperatures there relative to that area is probably pretty interesting in terms of what opportunities might arise there, either for agriculture or for direct use. So to say that this is an emerging market, I would also say that there are people putting a lot of work in this market to de-risk, to the point made earlier, the opportunities which already exist on the continent. And so I thought I'd finish with a little bit of another video. And so this is where Murray and Graham were the other day. So just to prove to you that we understand a little bit about what's going on under the ground, this is the Mornington Peninsula, and I have to thank Rockwater and Martin for this. And so the reality is Australia has some of the best documented and available information about what's going on under the ground. I think we might have a little bit of a pause issue here. Oh no, here we go, it's moving. And the best starting point is when you have lots of information. Yes, there'll be gaps, but I think in the case of Australia, if you have a clear map for where you want to go and what you want to do, where are my applications for heating, where are my applications for cooling, where are realistic power generation or co-located heat opportunities. The amount of information which is already available, plus that which people are exploring for and are starting to understand, we're actually this market's in quite a unique situation because a number of people who've worked in what I call the conventional geothermal industry or the high temperature geothermal industry are often not blessed with this type of information. We have significantly larger amount of risks because the investment in information in these areas has been far less, and I think that's part of the reason why we've seen such great success with the momentum starting to move in the US. Is yes, it might be disparate at times, but the USGS and the local surveys have done such a good job of being able to collate this. And so the point being here as the video moves forward is, here's a little example of a hot spring development, which is on its third stage now of being developed out and broadened, which gives so much more back to the community than just a power or heat project. There's jobs created in the economy here by keeping this thing running and making sure people can turn up and pay their fee to come into the building. And as we collect more information and understand more, that means that we have a far greater opportunity to be able to move forward. And so I guess the message that I wanted to give is, as a technology provider in this space, is we really want to see people succeed and do better with the technology at hand. And so with the things that have changed in industry over the past few years, I think what we can say is technology is evolving rapidly, and we really should be taking advantage of that. And I think Australia is in a position where right now is a really good time to be considering what opportunities are available here. As I think was really important in Jay's slide, is this isn't just about the energy transition, this is about energy security, and geothermal is probably one of the best energy security options you have because it's where it is and you can rely on it 24/7. Like we've talked about, the applications are not just in power generation, it's in heating, it's in cooling. There's been data center interest, which has been really public here, with Google talking about East Coast opportunities. But oil and gas and mining have to be partners that we need to think about. Integrated resource assessments and doing that at the earliest stage possible is having an impact. And what that's doing is starting to drive down Muddett's black part of her graph, which is getting through that hurdle of getting to returns as fast as possible. And I think in reality, Australia right now is in a position where if we can get some momentum and get some framework and get in the ears of people who want to listen, it's a little bit of a moment that might be akin back to when other people in this room are more familiar to me about what can happen when you get this big economy moving behind you. So anyway, that's all from me, and I hope I've made up some time post-lunch. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Sort of good news and good news. One is, first good news is lunch will be waiting for us out there, hopefully not too cold. The other good news is that the 3 virtual speakers in the next session have agreed to push back a bit, so that we don't have to sort of scramble through a 10-minute lunch. We can take half an hour. We will shorten lunch slightly. Instead of 40 minutes, we'll make it 30, and we'll be back here to start at 2 o'clock, which will be sort of a 20-minute delay on the schedule. If anybody has a really burning question online, Martin, for Jeremy, otherwise they can tackle him out in the lunch hall. And all you watching online, we're breaking for lunch here. We'll be starting up again in 30 minutes' time. But that session was opportunities for Australia. I hope it gave that impression that there really are real big opportunities for geothermal in Australia. The next session is technological developments and just what has changed in the 10 to 15 years since we last tried to do this seriously. And there's been some big changes in the world of geothermal, but we'll come back and talk about them. You're all free to go and eat. Thank you.